All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Um, my name is Diane Bosanchek. I will be your support contact during this webinar. A quick little reminder, this webinar is being recorded for archival purposes. If you have any issues, again, during the webinar, please use the chat feature below and someone from AIBS will assist you. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, please type in your question into the Q&A feature and someone from AIBS will relay your question to the presenter. Thank you again for joining today's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. DeJoy Crosland.
Hi, good afternoon to some and good morning to a few others. My name is Dr. DeJoy Crosland. I'm a senior scientist and program manager in the Scientific Peer Advisory and Review Services Division of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, or AIBS for short. Thank you for joining our webinar today. For those of you that are just discovering AIBS SPARS, we were established in 1963. We provide all manner of peer review and support services to facilitate competitive research programs. As a value partner in science, we truly believe that our work advances research through expert analysis and support that informs critical decisions. We take peer review very seriously and are continuously looking for ways to inform the public about the merits of and science behind peer review. One of the ways that we support this goal is through our webinar series. Our webinars are free and they're open to the public and focus on a variety of topics directly and tangentially related to peer review. The title of today's webinar is, Can We Increase the Quality of Research by Randomly Auditing Researchers? Our speaker, Professor Adrian Barnett, has a Bachelor of Science in Statistics from University College London and a PhD from the University of Queensland. He has worked over 21 years as a statistician, working for drug companies, research councils, and universities. He has a senior research fellowship from the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council. He is currently the vice president of the Statistical Society of Australia and is actually joining us from Brisbane, Australia. We are honored to have him as our speaker today and expect that his talk will be very informative and result in a lively discussion about this interesting concept of auditing research labs to improve research quality. As Diane mentioned, please reserve your questions to the end. Dr. Barnett, thank you for agreeing to actually wake up early and to share your knowledge today. The spotlight is now yours to begin your talk. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to Joy and Steve. And because of where we are in the world, I've actually been getting up regularly at this sort of hour because of all the World Cup games are on around now. Luckily, there isn't a clash with the World Cup game because one of my teams is still in it. So I just thought I'd give a quick introduction to who we are. So there's me and Nick Graves and Pauline Zardo. So we're the three people who worked on this paper. Nick is an economist who's done a lot on research funding, and Pauline Zardo is a policymaker who does a lot on the availability of research for policy. And then we're part of a wider group of meta-researchers, so people who do research on research. There's Tammy Hoffman, who's done some very interesting things on people describing their research properly. Ginny Barber, who was one of the founders of PLOS Medicine and who works on open access. Philip Clark, another economist who's leading the world's ever first study of randomization in funding to see what impact that has on people's careers. And Paul Glazier, who's done a lot of the work on research waste and the issues around that. And we're actually trying to get a sort of meta-research centre started here in Australia. So I'll start with a quote I often use from William Blake, who was a polymath. And it's, "To be in a passion you good may do, but no good if a passion is in you." So what I mean here is I'm not advocating audits. I'm not saying this is the answer. I'm just saying this is potentially interesting and something that is worth following up. You know, as scientists, we have to look at the evidence and judge things based on the evidence, not on any sort of personal motives. So I really have no idea whether these are a good idea, but I think it is a good idea to investigate this sort of thing, given some of the problems that we have at the moment in research. And then here's John Ioannidis, with his very famous paper, why most published research findings are false in PLOS Medicine, over 2.5 million views now, I think. And I mean, this is really, this is a canonical paper in meta research, and it's there because it's really shocking. John goes through using simulations and some empirical data to look at how now, basically, when I'm as a researcher now, when I pick up a paper, my prior hypothesis is this is probably wrong, and the paper has to show me that it's done everything right. I mean, that is a very strange situation to be in. I mean, and I think the public would think that most things that we publish would be right, with the occasional problem paper, whereas unfortunately it really does feel like or it is the other way around, and in most fields have a serious problem with papers that just are answering poor questions, are running their studies wrongly, are misinterpreting their results. Very big problems. That means the literature is just kind of undermined. And this is creating research waste. Here's an image I really love from the Boston Globe, with a researcher just sort of pipetting money away because of a simple problem with their test tube. And here's some great quotes from Veronique Kermer, the executive editor of PLOS. "It pays to be first. It doesn't necessarily pay to be right." And I think that's a very interesting quote that sums up a lot of the motivation for a lot of researchers at the moment. Get it out there, get the results out there. No time for checking, no time for verification, no time for deep discussion. It just has to get out there, and that, of course, that's one of the big drivers of a lot of the problems. And then Doug Altman, back in 1994 in the BMJ, very sad. Doug died about a month ago, and you just see the outpouring there was on Twitter, and Doug was a sort of a very ideal scientist, and certainly somebody I looked up to. So that was very sad, because he was still working and doing great work. And he said we need less research, better research, and more research done for the right reasons. And yeah, that's just a very that quote really gets to the heart of the problem. Slow down, do things properly. Of course, Doug said that back in 1994, and since then we've actually had an incredible explosion in the amount of papers. So the opposite has actually happened. And this is a bit of an extreme example, but it's an interesting one. So these people, if you read the titles of the paper there, I mean, the first 90% of the title is the same, and it's just the last bit. So they've done this study, and they managed to then produce 31 papers by doing the same study in just 31 different regions of Iran. These papers actually have since been withdrawn. But this kind of strange behavior that some researchers think is a good idea to try and score points. Like I said, this is an extreme example, but just last week I was talking to a researcher who really regretted splitting a paper into two to try and get 2 points, because they realized a few years later it would have been a much better and much more widely read paper if they'd have put it all the same experiment into one paper. So I think this is still happening. Then sort of the big motivation for this research was a paper by Paul Smaldino and Richard McElraith called The Natural Selection of Bad Science, which got a lot of publicity. It was a very interesting paper. And basically they set up a sort of Darwinian model of research and of science that I'll go through in a minute. But yeah, reading this and looking at a sort of simulated world got me thinking about if we could look at audits, because we actually had the idea of audits as one of the things we've been discussing for a while, but we're never really able to form a paper around it. So this gave us a sort of the framework for maybe being able to write a paper about this. Now, these next two slides are the most technical, so I will go through them slowly, but hopefully we'll all get there. So we can see on the left there, we've got a graph with a sort of nonlinear curve. What we have on the bottom there is the effort of the lab that goes from 1 to 100. So a lab with 100 effort, spends a lot of time on their research, does things well, and a lab with an effort of 1 is working very sloppily. Then what we've got at the y-axis is the probability of tackling a new hypothesis. So that's the probability that they start to work on a new question. Maybe they haven't even finished the last question, but they're going to start on this next one anyway. So what you can see there with that curve is that labs that use a lot of effort, they take on a new hypothesis every research cycle with a probability of 0.6. So there's a lot of time they actually keep working on their old hypothesis. Whereas a lab that has an effort of 1, they just take on a new hypothesis every time they can, because they're just interested in getting stuff out there. And that vertical dotted line is the starting effort for all labs in our simulation, so about 75. Then we have this 2x2 table here on the right-hand side. What we have there is labs are randomly given a hypothesis, and that hypothesis is going to be true or false, and because it's a simulated world, we know if it's true or false. Now, only 10% of hypotheses are true, so most labs are going to be given a hypothesis that is false. And that reflects, that, there's been some interesting debate on this, but I think that does reflect current thinking, which is most stuff doesn't work for one reason or another, because people are complicated, because biology and chemistry are complicated. It's hard to find stuff that works, even stuff that looks like everybody agrees on the surface of it is a good idea. For some reason, when that meets the public, things break down. So most stuff doesn't work. Then, so that's the 2 cells there on the left. Then the 2 columns are what the lab actually found. So whether the lab got it right, and when the hypothesis was true, they found a negative result, and when the hypothesis was false, they found a negative result, or when the hypothesis was true, they found a positive result. And the only cell we really have to worry about is the top right corner, which is a false positive. So that's when the hypothesis wasn't true, but the lab said it was. So that's what we call a false positive error. And there's an equation there, and the only thing you really have to focus on is the fact that E is in that equation. So their effort is in that equation, and it's in the equation on the bottom, on the denominator. So all you have to work out here is that clearly the higher the effort, the lower that probability is going to be. So that makes sense. So the more effort a lab puts in to its research, the less likely it's going to be to make a false positive error. And then those labs that don't employ a lot of effort will have a higher rate of false positives. Then the last thing to note is just the bottom of that column where we have the word payoff. And so this is another assumption. You only get a point in this system for publishing positive results. And that's reflecting the current, kind of literature and the current bias towards positive results. So if you find a negative result, you don't get any reward for publishing that. So it's only published positive results that people want to see published. And then around the end, we've got these arrows. So this cycle just goes around and around and around. Labs keep taking on new hypotheses, and then they keep getting rewarded or not, and they keep getting the right answer or not. Okay, and then the next stage is the birth and death process. So if we start off in the box on the left, we've got each of those little squares represents a lab. And we have 100 labs in our world. And there are 2 numbers, each lab has 2 numbers. It's their age. So obviously all labs start off at age 0, and then they accumulate a year every time they go around the cycle, the research cycle. And then they have their payoff. So we can see there's a lab there that's 24 years old and has accumulated 19 points. Another one that's 44 years old and accumulated 38 points. So they've published 38 positive papers in their 44 years. Or, well, not its age isn't in years, sorry, just in their 44, their age. Then what happens is we randomly select 10 labs from this 100. Then of those 10, we remove the oldest lab. So the lab up there, we've got 3 labs that I've shown, and the 50-year-old lab is going to be removed. And that just kind of simulates a sort of natural death process of, the older labs retiring, if you like. Of the remaining 9 labs, one of them is going to be chosen. And actually what the lab that we choose is the most successful lab. So now that green number, the lab with the highest payoff, they're going to be chosen to have a child laboratory. Now this sort of simulates the fact that, labs that do well and have high scores are more likely to get funding and have and produce postdocs that then go on and start their own labs. So that's just kind of trying to simulate the reward process. So the most successful lab reproduces, and it creates a new lab that is very much like it in every way. So we'll have the same effort as that lab, but there is a bit of I've forgotten the Darwinian word. There's a chance for a bit of a copy error in there, a bit of mutation. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. So that effort might change slightly, but it will be centered around the old lab's effort. So they might be a bit better than their parent or a bit worse. Then those 10 labs get put back in with the other 90 labs that weren't selected that time, and the process starts all over again. So we have this birth and death process. So each round, every lab will either take on a hypothesis or not. Every lab will either publish a positive or negative result or not, and then they'll accumulate points and they accumulate age. Some of those labs might be removed. Some of those labs might have a child, and then we go round and around and around all over and over again. So this is a Darwinian sort of process. You can think of these labs as very basic little animals or something. Then what Smaldino and McElroy showed was you get this kind of natural selection of bad science. And you can see the sort of most green of those lines is the effort. And effort gradually declines over time. So there's a selection for low effort. Don't work hard, just publish a lot, because you're the ones who are going to be rewarded. And then the other things that happen is the false discovery rate and that probability that we're looking at in the top right cell, the false positive probability, that's the light blue line, that just steadily creeps up and up and up and up. So there's selection for labs that don't work very hard and produce very poor research. And Paul and his colleague looked at a couple of different sort of assumptions and a couple of different simulations, but this, given what is a relatively simple sort of starting base, this same thing happened over and over again. So our idea was, well, what if we stuck in some audits into this process? Could we reverse this decline in effort? And I think it's a good point. It's a good time here to talk about the Leiden Manifesto, which is about rewards, and it's about measuring the performance against the research missions of the institution, the group, or the researcher. That's what the Leiden Manifesto talks about. Because the system that Paul had was just, and the system that we possibly are dominated by the moment is just a point for a publication. More points if it's in a high impact journal, regardless of whether it's true or not. That's what we're rewarding, so that's what we're getting. And then there's a great quote from Honora O'Neill, who I'll talk about again a bit later. Performance indicators have been chosen for ease of measurement and control rather than because they measure accurately what the quality of performance is. And I think that's a very key point here. It's very easy to measure impact factors, publication counts, citations. You can create programs that will give you league tables within a day for whole countries. But does it actually mean anything? Probably not. There's probably some signal in there, but there's a hell of a lot of noise as well. And then there's a hell of a lot of pressure and behavior change going on in there that says, well, this is what's important, so this is therefore what I'm going to do. What's that other great quote? Tell me how you're going to measure me, and I'll tell you how I'll behave. Well, at the moment, we're measured based on, grant income and high impact journals, so that's what everybody's going for. And then the last quote here: no metric should be taken as a substitute for the actual reading of a paper in determining its quality, which is a quote I thoroughly agree with. But the irony here is that quote comes from a paper that just invented a whole new metric based on citations. So that was almost the last sentence of the paper, which for me kind of undermined the whole idea of writing a paper on that. I don't think any metric is going to solve this problem, no matter how complicated the mathematics of it are. So inventing new metrics is not really the answer. But of course, then the huge problem we have is that there are just too many papers to read. So everybody agrees that reading a paper is a great way to determine if people are producing good research. But there's absolutely no way we can read everybody's paper, because the volume of research at the moment is just staggering. So that's where, an idea for, we have these problems elsewhere in society. And one area where you can't keep an eye on everybody, but you can keep an eye on some people, is with random breast tests. And this is just an incredible graph that shows the impact of random breast tests on fatal crashes in New South Wales, a state in Australia. And you can see the x-axis there. It's from quite a while ago, so it was introduced in sort of late 1982 by the looks of it. And the y-axis is the cumulative number of deaths. These deaths that no longer appeared in the statistics, essentially. And you can see there's just this beautiful, steady decline in deaths that just keeps on happening over time. So this was an incredibly successful policy. It led to instant behaviour change in people's attitudes towards drink driving. And the ideas that we're trying to pick up on here are, first of all, you can't take on everybody, but also you don't need to audit everybody. It's kind of the fear of being caught, the fear of being audited, and the very harsh punishments that there are for being caught drink driving. That's what drive this behaviour change. It doesn't just drive behaviour change in people who are caught. It drives behaviour change in the whole population. So we added into the simulation, we randomly audited a lab every J cycle, and I'll talk about that again a bit more. That just controls how often you dive in there and pick out a lab to audit. We decided up front that it must be an established lab with 50 or more papers. So we're going for the older labs because we thought maybe it's a bit unfair to audit younger labs. So let's just pull out the established ones. Then, which is a very important assumption, we have this network assumption. So we have the audited lab here in the middle. And what we assumed was a bit like what I was talking about earlier with the drink driving. You need this sort of vicarious thing happening. So if a lab was audited, then its parent lab would also potentially change behaviour, and so would any of the child labs that it had. Now, that assumption is based on the fact that, labs and researchers tend to keep in touch with one another. So if a lab has had a child, then, there may be researchers who are moving between them, or they're still in touch via email. So if a shocking thing like an audit happened to one of them, there would be chatter and they would talk about the process. Then another assumption that we thought was, well, we want these audits to have a fair amount of teeth. So we thought that 1 in 3 audits should end with that lab being removed if it had a poor score. So, and what that poor score was the number of false positives. So this is a bit of a questionable assumption. We did assume that we could count the number of false positives, although we did relax that. So we basically assumed we were so good at reading papers that we could work out where they'd made a mistake, where they'd got it wrong. So then we simply count the number of false positives, and also we know the rate of false positives in the population as well. So we can tell if your lab is a relatively bad performer or not. So if you're a above that vertical line, if you're in the top third, then we're going to remove you from the simulation, and another lab was chosen at random to add that 100th lab back into the system to keep it at 100 labs. And just with that network assumption as well, just to go back, the way it worked was that the child and parent labs, if a lab was audited, the child and parent labs would improve their effort. It would be a bit of a shock to them that a colleague had been audited, and that would prompt them to increase their effort. Okay, so obviously this is a costly process because if people are going to be reading things, that takes time. So what we assumed was we'd have one auditor to read every 10 papers, and each auditor would be employed for a month. So if you think of a lab with 50 papers, we'd be employing 5 auditors for 1 month, and we assume these are kind of peers, very highly qualified people. We thought half will probably be professors and half associate professors. So we have a salary cost there in 2016 dollars of 105,000. So we can work out, an estimate of the financial costs of doing this. So what happens? Here is a whole bunch of graphs. I'll talk you through them. So if we look at the top left graph with no audit, what we have there is, I think I randomly selected 20 individual simulations, because of course, every time we do this, we do about 1,000 simulations of these little worlds. And the darker red line is the average. And what we've got on the y-axis is the false positive probability. So we can see this is basically just repeating the Smaldino results. But what happens is, in a world without audits, this false positive probability, these mistakes, they increase. There's a point at which the process starts, and then it actually happens pretty quickly. And just to show what's interesting is that the red line is the average. So you can see in individual worlds this sort of competitive spiral that we've called it, where labs just switch to this model of just pumping stuff out rather than worrying about whether it's right or not. That actually happens very quickly in each individual simulation. And the average looks a bit slower because it's just taking into account that this spiral kind of happens at different times. So, a bunch of labs decide or the mutation happens and a bunch of labs decides they're going to change to this new system. They become successful and they spread and they have lots of children. So that's what's happening there. So then in the top right, if we audit a lab every 150 research cycles, you can see that we're having some impact, but there's still quite a lot of competitive spirals. Then if we audited a lab every 75 times, you can see we're having a bit more of an impact. Quite a lot of these, and now we're actually also getting simulated worlds where there was no competitive spiral, that the line stays along the bottom of the x-axis there, or y-axis, sorry, rather. And then if we audit every 50th time, it only happens a couple of times now. It can still happen that the competitive spiral beats the audits, but a lot of the time it doesn't happen. We manage to keep a lid on this. And then the table just points out that for 50 audits, we can see if we audit every 50th cycle, that would mean reading basically 2% of all papers, or 1.9% of all papers. And because the numbers were a bit large, we decided to scale them to something meaningful. And it means an additional cost per paper of $169. So that's for all papers produced in this research world. We'd have to pay $169 as a sort of premium for avoiding this competitive spiral. Oops. The other thing the audits did, which was very interesting, was it avoided the explosion in paper numbers. So what the graph on the left here shows just the number of papers produced over time. and the black line shows no audits. And so you can see we have this exponential increase because, you know, there's this selection for labs with low effort who just take on a lot of research. And funny enough, I mean, if you look at papers by people like Hilda Bastian that tracks just the number of papers over time, that curve actually matches reality very well. If you look at like the last 2 decades, there has been this explosion. So as you increase the frequency of the audits there down to the green line where we're looking at, you know, auditing every 50th research cycle, the number of papers stays down because you're selecting for those labs that keep their effort high. So that's a happy thing to happen because, you know, we know one of the problems with the current system is there's just so much to read that people find it hard to keep on top of the literature. So those higher quality labs produce fewer, better papers. It's sort of exactly what Doug Altman wanted. And then the graph on the right just shows the effort. So everybody starting from around 75. And we can see actually in the world where we audit every 50th time, the effort actually increases. We're actually selecting for slightly higher effort with a bit of a bend. And then, yeah, in the black line where there's no audits, you know, effort just eventually by the end of the simulation time has just decreased to 1. Everybody's putting in no effort. We did do some sensitivity analysis. So these graphs don't have any X or Y axis on them, but basically the X axis is time and the Y axis is this, you know, this competitive spiral. So that the higher that line, the worse things are, the less we've been able to keep a lid on the competitive spiral. So if we audited younger labs, just those with 25 papers, that didn't work as well. And there's a couple of reasons why. One reason is if you audit an older lab that has more papers, then you have a bigger sample size to count the number of false positives, which means you're just going to be more accurate basically at identifying the poor performing labs. So obviously the smaller and smaller sample size you go to, the more chance there is that you're going to remove actually a lab that had a good effort but just had a bit of bad luck. The other reason for that works is, of course, the older a lab is, the more children labs it has, and therefore the bigger the impact of an audit because there's more children labs for it also to have an impact on. We added some measurement error to the auditors. So, you know, assuming the auditors can perfectly pick the number of false positives is, most very likely a step too far. So we added a sort of 20% error either way. They either overestimated the errors by 20% or underestimated it, and that was done with a random distribution, so the error could be anywhere in between those two numbers. And that didn't impact at all. In fact, if anything, it was slightly better, but I think that was just a chance finding. It really didn't have much of an impact. And that's possibly because, you know, it was a fairly large sample size, and kind of even if the audit didn't work that well, you still increased effort across a bunch of labs. Then in the bottom left, this was the most interesting, and this actually came from one of our reviewers. What we've got here, there's quite a few lines on here. We've got the blue line at the top shows where we didn't have any increase in effort. So that's in a world where we just remove labs. So we can see that's not doing very well at all because you get this competitive spiral happens a lot. So, you know, not having that increased effort in labs that were audited and their children and parents is, definitely harms the system. The green line is where labs, which is our starting assumption, labs in the network, the parent and children labs, they increase their effort by 10. We thought that was a reasonable kind of number, on a scale of 1 to 100, that an audit would be quite a shock to the system. So therefore you'd have a pretty big improvement in your effort. And that did work better than 0. But actually the one that worked really well, which was quite a surprise, but does make sense, is if those labs in the network only improve their effort by 1. So this is a very paradoxical result, that smaller increases in effort actually kept a lid on this competitive spiral much better. And doing a bit of digging, the reason was those labs that improved their effort by 10 kind of became too different. They were outcompeted by the labs that still kept on the low effort line and kept pumping out results. So, but those labs that just improved by 1, they were still sort of competitive with the other labs in terms of numbers, but slightly outcompeted them also in terms of quality, in terms of the number of false positives. So that's an interesting assumption that may actually happen in real life too. You know, too big a change to your practice can make you look like a bit of an outlier and make you look a bit odd, even if it's a very good improvement for society. So it's this smaller effort, this smaller, slower change actually did a lot better. So what were the learnings from the simulation? Well, we thought it did seem clear that it's best to examine the entire work of a lab rather than a single paper in a reproducibility exercise. So the Smaldino et al. Paper, the Smaldino-McElreath paper, they did actually do another simulation, which I haven't shown you, where they kind of, randomly did a replication exercise on labs, and if that replication exercise didn't go well, then that lab would be punished. But that didn't work very well, and it's possibly because that's just a sample size of 1, and it is in science is difficult, and sometimes results don't come the way you expect. So getting one study wrong is not really a big crime. So what we thought was, well, we're looking at the entire work, and we're looking at where people consistently have a problem. And I think that is a better idea. Labs that improved too far from the current norms were disadvantaged. So that's just what I was talking about. If labs greatly increased their effort and made themselves look like a bit of an outlier, then even though that was a good thing from our perspective, they were outcompeted by their colleagues who maintained their low effort. It's clear that this impact on the child and parent labs is key, and we only assumed, that the increase in effort would happen via these direct networks. There is a chance that an audit would be so scary that everybody would improve their effort, but for the moment we just thought, well, let's just keep it to the immediate labs in the network. And it did look like the improvements, the impact of the audit was fairly robust to some sort of auditor error. So that's quite important, because we know peer review is not perfect. So we'd expect some kind of error in the system, but it's robust to, we looked at a plus minus 20% error, and it was robust to that. What could the audits do in real life? Well, this is probably the key slide in the whole talk, really. What would an audit be able to do? And I think it'd be able to do a lot of these things that metrics can't. It would be able to do a bit of digging and a bit of detective work. You'd be able to find, for example, funded projects that were never published. We know that is a big problem. Some papers put the estimates as high as 50%, where there's money was given to a study and we never see the results, probably because they were negative, or because they just ran out of money in time. But that is a very serious issue. That's one of the most serious issues we have currently in research, because then that entire effort is wasted, and we don't know the answer to that hypothesis, so somebody else probably starts down that road. So that's a serious issue, which an audit could join the dots on that one. An audit could ask the simple question of, was the study original for its time? Did the authors do a systematic review? Did they see that they were answering an important novel question, or had they simply missed something and were just repeating something that had already been done? Again, that's a current big problem, and something that would be worthwhile to look at. Did the published methods match the protocol? Ben Goldacre's COMPARE trial is looking at this at the moment, and again, the statistics are pretty bad, especially in some of the big journals. The people do a randomized trial and say, oh, we're gonna, blood pressure is our key outcome, and then when it comes to the published paper, it's weight loss or triglycerides. They're suddenly the primary outcome because they had a better result. But that is, again, going to produce very biased results. Were the results translated into practice, that's a huge thing, that we're currently not measured on at all. And it is very hard to do. But I think if you're sitting actually reading stuff, you can see where they've actually had an impact on practice, which should be the number one priority, because this is actually changing people's lives. Salami slicing should be very easy to look at, and then also repeated problems with study methods, lack of blinding, using the wrong statistical methods repeatedly. If there was repeated problems with manipulated images, at the moment these problems are being picked up sort of singly, but if you audited a whole lab, you'd be able to see these repeated problems. And then lastly, you would be able to see the overall direction of the research group as well, although you probably wouldn't want to punish someone too harsh on that, but you would be able to see whether they had a sort of consistent arc and were moving in an interesting way. But there are a huge number of downsides. The audits would be very costly in time and in money. Employing these auditors would be difficult. It would be stressful for those who are audited, no doubt. This could be a very stressful time, while you're waiting for that report to come in. It's going to be very unpopular with researchers, likely, especially those who get booted out. And you can imagine that certainly here in Australia, some of the very high-profile researchers are also very well politically connected. So you can imagine what would happen, and they'd go to the newspapers and say, this is unfair, this is not right. The auditors themselves could be subject to cronyism and undue influence, especially if we're taking auditors from the same group of researchers. I mean, they would be the ideal people. There's definitely a chance of the wrong kind of influences and the wrong kind of motivations to happen there. A big problem is it could harm average performers by damning with faint praise. I think that's a very interesting problem. So somebody, if just an average lab and got an average report, that could actually harm them in the current world where, everybody has to strive for excellence to be the best. But actually an average lab that's doing fine, that makes an average number of mistakes is probably not a bad thing. We're more interested in that tail, the people who are performing very badly. I think the system would have to vary by scientific field, because clearly, the fields have very different ideas about what is good and bad practice and what the big problems are in each field. That's fine, but that could cause some disagreement and debate. These guys get audited on that, but we have to do this. And then another very, very big problem is there's likely still to be pressure to publish or perish. So because of other incentives, like block funding. So if audits aren't the only game in town, then people are still going to be pressured into this sloppy science system in other ways. So, you've got two masters essentially. So how important would the audits be relative to all these other pressures you have on your time? Some reaction to so this paper was published in PLOS One. The first reaction was that the review took almost a year, and actually by the end of it, the reviewers' comments were longer than our actual paper. So, we knew this was going to be controversial, and some of the comments were very insightful, but there was a lot of them. And then we've got people saying things like, hell no, there's some reaction I've had, we need to retain some semblance of democracy in research, and this would erode that significantly. Adrian, as if our jobs aren't stressful enough. Why don't we change the metrics? Which I don't think is the answer. As I've said, I don't think any metric is going to solve this problem. I'm glad I'm reaching the end of my career. I'm a bit tired about the good ideas, how to fix the system. That one hurt a bit. And then some positive one. Barnett and colleagues presented one of the most effective solutions to current issues related to research data quality, but we do not seem ready yet to implement and tolerate the consequences. Although I would say that positive comment came from a company that seemed to be positioning themselves to do this kind of audit work. So probably likely to get a positive comment from them. But, random audits do actually exist. So the Science Foundation in Ireland uses random audits of labs. I don't know how they're working, but they check on their experimental details and data. Random audits were actually suggested for the research world back in 1988. Drummond Rennie said that groups of journal editors could get together and randomly audit some papers. And Edward Huth quoted at the time, who was the editor of the Annals, saying, yeah, I think this would be a good idea, and that scientists would accept this. So it's not a new idea. And Steve's pointed out to me that intramural labs in the US do get audited with 3 or 4 staff. doing that work. And of course, we have clinical audits, which are a very popular way of keeping tabs on whether people are doing the right things as doctors and nurses. This is a very interesting article I read recently from The Guardian, and you can see the subtitle there. When a colleague with shaky data raced a competitor first to publish, I saw how the perverse incentives in research work. So this is a very interesting article where, you know, just like the quote from Veronique Kermer that we had earlier, it pays to be first, it doesn't necessarily pay to be right. You know, this is a clear anecdote of people pushing something out because they felt that another lab was going to beat them to the race. But the interesting thing is, you know, this comes from an anonymous academic. This person did not want their name published because they knew how harmful that would be to their career. So, you know, there is an idea that maybe this, if the audits works, they could be backed up by a sort of anonymous reporting system. But, you know, that could easily be, you know, open to abuse as well by people reporting people that they just didn't like. And then Honora O'Neill, who's an Irish philosopher, has written a lot on trust and freedom, not just in science, across the public service. And she's talked about this audit explosion and the lack of trust in professionals and public servants. And she talks about an unending stream of new legislation and regulation memoranda and instructions, guidance and advice. And her Reith lectures down there, I really recommend listening to those. So yeah, you know, I'm very sympathetic to this. I mean, there is an issue that this audit system could be just another layer of regulation and bureaucracy that would just harm scientists and not free them up. But I would argue by just auditing a few people and by doing it well, you actually free up scientists to do the right thing. You know, working in this area, one of the most interesting comments I've ever had, and I've had this from a couple of people, is, oh, Adrian, you know, look, I really want to do the right thing, but I know, you know, Professor X or Professor Y down the road is not, and I have to keep up with them. So I do sometimes feel that audits could free people up to do the right thing by rewarding those people. No idea whether that would actually work. So thanks for your time. So the current reward system is based on quantity, and that is deeply ingrained at the moment, and it's going to need a large change to shift the focus to quality. So that's why we're considering relatively radical ideas like this. Now, of course, our simulation model of audits was very naive. It was very simplistic. You know, there's a whole heap of things that it didn't take into account. It's just a very first preliminary step, you know, to see whether this is at all plausible. And Paul Smaldino has a great quote in a great paper. He says, all models are stupid, but we need more models, which I think is a very nice quote. You know, models are not the real world, but we can learn some interesting things. So the next stage, I think, is to try and pilot test a random audit. But obviously that would need quite a bit of funding because we know the audits would be expensive. But, you know, we could ask some interesting questions there about how researchers would react and how their institutions would react. And then the big question about what good and bad practices could be detected by the audit. So if you want to work on that, get in touch with me because we're going to try to do that next. But getting funding for this might be very hard because I think the reviewers will not like this idea, or certainly a decent proportion of them will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. We're going to now open everything up for questions for the attendees. As Diane mentioned in the beginning, if you have a question, please type it into your chat bar, which I believe should be at the bottom right of your screen. And I will relay those questions to Dr. Barnett so that he can answer those questions. So as we get started, I have a question, so I'll start it off. In your paper, Dr. Barnett, you mentioned that one of the most questionable assumptions was the ability of the auditors, which I took to be the peer review team, to establish a history of false positives. I thought that was very interesting. Can you elaborate on your thoughts about this issue you mentioned in the paper?
Yeah, the auditors are the peer reviewers. Yeah, this is the main issue, why the peer review took about a year. Yeah, I mean, it is a questionable assumption. So, you know, the idea false positives can take a while to come to light. A lab might publish a paper saying, "Oh, this drug works for blood pressure," and then it's not till like 5, 8, 10 years later that other trials are done, or it comes to light that, well, actually, no, that's wrong. That didn't work. So, and some of them don't even, people don't even bother investigating them because it seems like an established truth. So, yeah, false positives are very hard to detect. So, what we did to get around that, we also did another simulation, which I didn't present today, which was where those labs that had a low effort, they also made a lot of mistakes in their research, like not using blinding or using the wrong stats method. So we also had a sort of third score for them, where we could count the number of mistakes that they made, and then we looked at whether the auditors, you should be able to spot mistakes more easily, people manipulating an image, people not doing a systematic review, those should be countable. And the same, we had pretty much the same success. So I think we're okay on that one.
Nice. Let's see. Have any questions coming?
Joy, could I ask one?
Sure, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Steve from AIBS. I had a couple questions. Thanks for the intriguing talk. I was just wondering, like one of the things that was interesting was the improvements in quality, that small improvements in quality seem to yield better kind of long-term results in terms of them keeping competitive and all that. But I wonder, so that means presumably that they're improving, the overall standards by which they're, conducting these studies. But I mean, will it change also potentially the types of studies that they'll do? And by that, I mean more exploratory versus hypothesis-driven, or I'm just kind of wondering if there are different types of science that will be incentivized by this system, and if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I think that is very possible. Yeah, if this became important, then yeah, people would react to it. So I think what you have to do then is, what I like about an audit system is you have more control over what you're rewarding. The current system on quantity, it's out of control.
Yeah.
So if we design the audits, well, then we could reward people for. It doesn't matter if it's a replication study. It doesn't matter if it's an original study. It actually just matters if you did it right. So then you're saying to people, you do what you think is important. We're not cramping your scientific freedom. All we want to check on is that, technically you did the right thing. And then hopefully the scientists would be more free in that way. But look, that could possibly happen if people felt they were more, or if people read the reports and thought, oh, that lab did well and they do this kind of study, we need to repeat what they do. Yeah, that could happen.
I'm just thinking maybe in some of these things like p-hacking or salami slicing or whatever. I mean, if you don't know really what you're getting after, you may call it exploratory and get away with getting around the system a little bit in terms of, it's harder for the auditors to check whether you originally proposed one metric by which you're going to measure the success of this experiment, and then you end up choosing a different one like you had suggested earlier.
Yeah, look, well, I think one thing the auditors could check on is if there was a protocol. That's a good thing to do, if there's a protocol, and then follow up. So that would partially solve that. And I think p-hacking and exploratory analysis, I think that's fine. I suppose if you're doing that a couple of times, it's okay. If that's all you're doing, then that's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah, that's true. The other question I had real quick is also if this was to become part for the course, and these reports were potentially public. Well, I was just wondering, I kind of wonder how long the lag time is in terms of the mark against somebody if their reputation is damaged by some of these things, especially if there's like you mentioned, a 20% error rate is what you estimated. But let's presume there's some, high error rate there. If it was made public, it may be that even if it was corrected and they were wrong, that it may still impact the grants that they submit and stuff like that. So you kind of mentioned that in your final slide, I suppose, about it can't work in isolation; it has to work with other systems as well. But.
Yeah, look, I think these would have to be public. I think if they weren't public, there would be a lot of suspicion around them. So yeah, they'd have to be on a website where everybody could read them. The scientists involved would also have to be allowed to have some kind of right of reply as well, and maybe that could be published alongside. But yeah, I mean, look, if there was a really bad report, what you'd hope is that the reputational damage would be pretty rapid, and those people would be removed from the system. If there was a report that was kind of lukewarm, maybe that group would find it hard to continue to get funding and attract postdocs. Yeah, that does worry me a bit.
The average one, right? Yeah.
The average one, yeah. And look, it might take a while for the system to sort of warm up and for people to work out how it works and what's going on. So it's probably, I think we suggested in the paper that you run it for a year without publicly releasing any of the reports, just to sort of get a bit of a run-in on what the reports would actually look like. Somebody did suggest, though, that if this took off, you might find labs wanted to be audited to get these reports. If these reports became the new gold standard, it would be an irony that people would actually want to be audited, and then you'd possibly have people setting up auditing companies where they gave people the kind of report they wanted. So yeah, it's a complicated system, and academics are very good at gaming systems. So even a system like this, it could be gamed, I think, but it's harder to game this system than the simple publish system.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thanks.
All right, so we have hold on, 2 questions that I'm going to try to get to. First one is, can you define how effort is measured? Does it only consider how many people are working on a project, or how much time is spent on the project?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, in the system, it's probably a bit of both. I mean, it's a very simplistic system. Effort just dictates how likely you are to take on a new hypothesis. So I suppose if you had a lot of people working for you, you'd be more likely to do that. And if you were just a bit sloppy. So it could be kind of either, I'd think. Sorry, that's not a great answer, but it's a simple simulation really on that front. We didn't go that deep.
Awesome. Okay, so this one isn't really a question, but since we're at our hour, it might be kind of good to end on this. So it says, I received funding from a drug company for my PhD and had my data evaluated by the drug company rep every 6 months, which, while it was a pain, became part of my course of study. Instilling accountability and good scientific integrity at entry level could be the first step to improving scientific integrity and accountability, and made part of the PhD award system, setting the stage for periodic auditing throughout a researcher's career. So what are your thoughts on that? Interesting.
Yeah, look, I think that's very interesting. So my first ever job straight out of university was with a drug company. And actually, they ran very tight trials and I learnt a lot from them. So I mean, drug companies get a lot of stick, for some things they do. But I think their standards of running experiments are actually very high. Now, one reason they're able to do that is because they're able to employ a lot more people and take their time and increase this effort. So I think part of the problem is that in the research world, we're maybe expecting too much from academics. We expect them to produce too much, and that's what leads to this problem. So maybe we should be a bit more like drug companies. Who'd have thought an academic would say that? But I think there are things to learn from them.
Awesome. Well, I am a stickler for time, and it is 5:01. So I will say thank you so much, Dr. Barnett, for such an insightful presentation and discussion. Thank you so much for just taking out time to explain this research to us. It's still very intriguing to all of us here at AIBS SPARS. We would like to thank you to all the participants for questions and for participating in our webinar series. We hope that each of you will join us for one of our future webinars, and take a moment to please visit our website at aibs.org to learn more about our programs. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. And Dr. Barnett, have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Joy.
Thank you.